in kind to the notion that in connection with the political process, it's very dangerous to be using prosecutorial tools in the midst of a presidential campaign.
Can Americans trust the DOJ and FBI?
Well, I think that's why public scrutiny is appropriate here. That's why I think both sides are weighing in. And I think ultimately, public sentiment and the American people will decide whether or not there was an abusive process here. Also,
but
I think
the thing. There's so much, back and forth, the political bickering. Does it break down, Robert, the public trust in crucial institutions meant to stabilize our government, our criminal justice system, and our democracy?
Look, public scrutiny is never a bad thing, and I understand that both sides are going to try to take a cut at this in terms of, who is the more malevolent actor here. The public understands that that's part of the political process, but I think the bigger picture to be focused on is to be concerned about abusive process in connection with politics and foreign counterintelligence.
We need experts like you. We need our leaders. We need our politicians who were elected to govern and run this country. We need everyone to submit information that is not so laden with political bias. We're not. It feels like the American public is not getting the truth, so they can't really make a proper assessment.
But remember also, there's a process here where they had to go to a court, and so the onus is also on the FISA court that received the information. If they didn't get the kinds of information that they thought that they should have, to ask further questions and to have further identification of this. I think there should be in the future more sophistication throughout the process to ensure that everybody recognizes and understands the dangers presented by mixing politics with the foreign intelligence gathering process. Those are serious tools to be used and necessary to protect the interests of the country, but understand that if you do so in the political process, there are real dangers presented by that. I think that's what the president and Republicans that's the position that they're presenting, and I think their position has some merit. Put me down on the side of being concerned about this.
Got it. So both memos are out, and we haven't learned anything new, right?
Well,
yes.
I don't know if it's new. You can understand that politics would be played. All I am saying is that I think it's a legitimate question, contrary to the Democrats' contention, to be concerned about this.
Okay. I think we all are concerned for various reasons. Robert Ray, thank you so much for joining us here.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Eric?
And with that, we have a Fox's alert on North Korea. As Molly Hennenberg just reported a moment ago, dictator Kim Jong-un could be taking a step toward diplomacy. Members of a high-level North Korean delegation told South Korean officials that the young strongman is open to talks with Washington. This comes as the U.S. imposed its toughest sanctions yet to try and pressure the regime to give up its nuclear and missile programs. All while Pyongyang continues, though, to develop those missiles, you see, that some experts say could potentially hit us. President Trump has warned of the possibility of military options if the new sanctions do not work.
If the sanctions don't work, we'll have to go phase 2. And phase 2 may be a very rough thing, may be very, very unfortunate for the world.
So what does all this mean? Former United States Ambassador to the United Nations John Bolton joins us, a Fox News contributor, senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and chairman of the Gatestone Institute here in New York. So, Ambassador, should we sit down with the regime? Should we talk with them with no preconditions?
Well, I think it would be a complete waste of time. I think this is a propaganda effort, 378 in connection with North Korea's participation in the Olympics as the closing ceremonies take place. They grace us with the possibility of talking to them. We've been through this so many times over the past 25 years. You'd think that that the mainstream media would lose interest in hearing it yet again. Look, the administration is going to say, yeah, we're willing to talk because it looks unreasonable to particularly to naive people. if you say you're not willing to talk, but at least I have confidence this administration isn't going to change its policy. North Korea can talk all at once. I think the president's still committed to denuclearization. But, you know, honestly, it just gets tiresome after a while to watch the North Koreans play us like this and play the South Koreans.
Yeah, you know, I mean, as you point out, the 1994 oil for food deal with the President Clinton, they snookered us completely on that. They pulled the wool over our eyes in the six-party talks that went poof. Here's part of a statement the White House just released a few moments ago. They say, quote, "We will see if Pyongyang's message today that it is willing to hold talks represents the first steps along the path to denuclearization. In the meantime, the United States and the world must continue to make clear that North Korea's nuclear and missile programs are a dead end." But, you know, Ambassador, they're never going to give up their nuclear program.
They're never going to give it up voluntarily, that's for sure. And, you know, the president, the Treasury Department announced new sanctions on Friday, just before the president said we're also looking at phase 2, as he called it. But the fact is, North Korea is one of the world's biggest grifters. They get resources and support from everywhere. And we learned during the course of the Olympics that the government of South Korea essentially paid for the cost of North Korean participation in the Olympics. That's one more source of subsidy. They get it in all kinds of different ways. So you can sanction 27 new ships that were offloading or unloading oil at sea to be taken into North Korean harbors. They're going to find other ways to avoid the sanctions. Certainly Iran is not going to be deterred by more unilateral U.S. sanctions. I think North Korea is one of their partners. So you can't be distracted by this sort of smoke and mirrors effort. CIA Director Mike Pompeo, it's important to reflect on this very seriously, said last month that North Korea was within a handful of months, his phrase, a handful of months of being able to hit targets in the United States. How much talking with North Korea do you think we can do that's going to make a difference in that unpleasant reality?
Yeah, that is absolutely chilling. Meanwhile, you mentioned something, that's the naval issue. There's a plan to perhaps deploy the Coast Guard to interdict ships on the way or coming from North Korea with suspicious material. I mean, do you think that'll work? North Korea calls that an act of war. Now, a naval blockade under international law is an act of war. Do you think deploying the Coast Guard will succeed?
Well, it depends on how aggressive they're going to be. Look, in the Bush administration, we created a thing called the Proliferation Security Initiative that was intended to interdict trafficking in weapons and materials of mass destruction. We're not talking about that directly here, but we're talking about the trade into North Korea that helps sustain it. And I think that since the threat that North Korea poses with its nuclear weapons program is getting more and more to the point where it can actually be used against the United States, used against Japan, used against other countries in the region, if we're not thinking of these additional steps, we'll be left with two alternatives. One is North Korea has nuclear weapons, and by the way, can sell them to anybody with hard currency. We're going to have to, or the other alternative is looking at military force. You know, if you deploy the Coast Guard, we don't know what North Korea's reaction is going to be. They may take that as an act of war, as they've said, and we find out what their retaliation would be before we go after the nuclear program.
I mean, you point that out, and very quickly, finally, there are other nations that are potentially part of this deployment. But remember, in 2010, they torpedoed a South Korean ship. 48 or so sailors were killed. And the USS Pueblo, 1968. It's now part of a museum in Pyongyang, part of the Fatherland War of Liberation Museum. I mean, they tortured and took, and one of our sailors was killed. They tortured and took them hostage.
Right, and when they sank that South Korean vessel, they killed 46 people, and the person widely believed in South Korea, the general in charge of that operation, was the head of the North Korean delegation to the closing ceremonies of the Olympics. That's the real face of North Korea right there.
It's unbelievable. Ambassador John Bolton, as always, thank you so much.
Thank you, Eric.
Of course. Arthel?
Eric, well, the Democrats' rebuttal to the DEMS Memo goes public, and they say it shows the Department of Justice and the FBI followed procedure. Killed in a mass shooting. The latest on the investigation. That's up next.
No 18-year-old should be able to have a gun that can kill multiple people within seconds.
Do you plan to be back on Wednesday?
I'm not sure. I don't think so. Not until our schools are safe.
Handled the deadly mass shooting at Stoneman Douglas High School. This as pressure is mounting on Broward County Sheriff Scott Israel to step down.
Let me be perfectly clear. Our investigation to this point shows that during this horrific attack, while this killer was inside the school, there was only one law enforcement person, period, and that was former Deputy Scott Peterson.
Matt Finn is live from Parkland, Florida, now with more. Matt?
Arthel, we just heard a portion of the Broward County Sheriff's interview on CNN this morning. In the full interview, he was asked if he's going to take any responsibility for the multiple red flags and phone calls into his office about the shooter, Nicholas Cruz. And the sheriff says he could only take responsibility for what he knows, and went on to say that it was beyond his control that the school resource officer, one of his deputies on scene at the school behind me on the day of the shooting, became a, quote, deserter. Of course, all of this has led to a fiery debate and intense due to his gross incompetence and inaction is growing. Now, Representative Hager released a copy of the letter he wrote to the governor calling for the Sheriff Israel to resign or be removed from his office. The sheriff is clearly not resigning at this moment. In fact, the sheriff released a letter he wrote to the governor in response to Representative Hager's demand for him to be removed. The sheriff trying to clarify that on the day of the shooting, there was only one deputy on campus during the attack, and all other responding officers and deputies were here after the shooter had already fled. The sheriff also clarifying that his deputies responded to 18 calls about the shooter, and that 16 of 18 of those calls were handled correctly. However, the sheriff admits 2 out of 18 of those are currently under investigation. We'd like to give you a live look now at the growing memorial outside of the school, which really has expanded to several city blocks as hundreds of people continue to pour in to bring notes and balloons. Today is the first time that students will be invited back to campus. Beginning at 3 p.m. local time, there will be an orientation for students to ease themselves back into classes which are scheduled to resume this week. And we'd like to point out that the school district told us that the school district has proposed to the state legislator that it would like to proceed with tearing down the building in which
an emotionally charged environment right now. Coming up a little later, our panel will delve into how we might find the right balance between security and Second Amendment rights.
Arthel, meanwhile, President Trump threatening to yank federal immigration officials out of California. That over the state's sanctuary policy for illegal aliens. We'll talk to a retired U.S. Marshal who worked with ICE and get his take on the president's warning. And you know, the controversial Democratic counter memo, do you think it answers Republican allegations against the Justice Department and the FBI?
The more we peel this back, the more facts that come out. The American people are beginning to learn how corrupt this process really has been, and it's downright scary.